come to order. This is the meeting of the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Standing Committee of the House of Commons. Welcome, everyone. I'll just note today that we have Joël Lightbound sitting in for Remy Massey. Welcome, Joël. And I'll also acknowledge that we're meeting on traditional Algonquin territory, for which we're very grateful, as always. We have an hour of witnesses. 2 witnesses are joining us for the first hour. I'd like to welcome them at this point. So welcome, please, to appearing as an individual, Michael Chandler, and Michael is on the left screen, members. Michael Chandler, Professor Emeritus, University of British Columbia, Department of Psychology. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us. And on the right side is, again, appearing as an individual, Christopher Lalonde, Professor, University of Victoria, Department of Psychology. And that's on the right. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us. We're very grateful for your time today. The way this will work, you may be familiar, is that I'm happy to offer each of you 10 minutes to address the committee. What I'll do when there's about a minute left, I'm going to start waving a yellow card around, so you might catch that motion of color on your screen. And then when the time is up, I'll wave a red card around and ask you to come to the close at that point. And then from there, we'll go into rounds of questions from committee members. And we're all together for 1 hour. So we'll hear from each of you, 10 minutes each, and then we'll go into questions. Are we going to have the... So we'll do the 2 presentations consecutively, and then have the questions combined to both of the witnesses. So with no further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Chandler to have the floor for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Am I on speaker now?
You are indeed.
Good. Well, good afternoon to you and the rest of the committee. As you've done, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the traditional territories of the Coast and Strait Salish peoples. And as you remarked, I'm an emeritus professor, which essentially means that you do everything you used to do but don't get paid for it. I want to begin by saying that Dr. Christopher Lalonde, who will speak after me, has been my close colleague for more than 30 years, and that together we have considered a range of matters having to do with the health and the well-being of Indigenous people, both in Canada and various other places around the world. Now, the large bulk of this work concerns the problem of youth suicide in all of the Commonwealth's many outposts. Today I want to talk about this complicated matter by speaking only about 2 issues. The first of these concerns the effective impossibility of successfully picking out which particular youth from a given Indigenous community will or will not successfully take their own lives. And the second set of remarks concerns various studies that Christopher Lalonde and I have done concerning the general proposition that cultural wounds require cultural medicine. And I'll try to unpack that in a moment. But let me begin with what I think is a more straightforward matter having to do with suicide rates and the effective impossibility of deciding who among Canada's Indigenous youth will or will not commit suicide. Now, as you're perhaps aware, suicide rates are customarily reported as deaths per 100,000. Now, for Canada's general youth population, this ratio is approximately 4 or 5 individuals per 100,000. the risk effectively doubles among the whole of Canada's Indigenous youth. Now, one need not be a statistical whiz to recognize that the odds of any given youth actually taking their life is especially small, and the prospect of fashioning some assessment tool capable of picking out such individuals is effectively vanishing. Now, our usual intuitions about such matters turns out to fail us. When asked, people might offer the notion that depression is a predictor of youth suicide, but good studies have suggested that something like 70% of Canadian youth report being depressed, seriously depressed, at some times in their lives, and that they also similarly think about the possibility of suicide. Now, so the question then becomes, how might we try to intervene into this problem and address the fact that somewhere out there, troubled youth are on their way to actually committing suicide. Now, there is an enterprise which you may or may not be alert to, and broadly they're called gatekeeper projects. So across the Commonwealth, many hundreds of millions of dollars are currently being spent annually on so-called gatekeeper project interventions. Now, in short, the common core of all such projects is to identify and train community-level paraprofessionals to identify youth at special risk to suicide. Now, although having the virtue of employing various sorts of community members, all of these projects share the common but fatal flaw of wrongly assuming that it is possible to pick out which particular youth are especially vulnerable. No one knows how to do this. As an insurance actuary let loose on this problem, one would simply conclude that no one will ever commit suicide, and they would be right, they would be wrong 4 or 8 times per 100,000, and right 99,995 times in a row. So the issue here has prompted Chris Lalonde and I to refocus our attention at a higher level of aggregation by looking at whole communities rather than single individuals. And there's some attempt to capture all of this with the pat phrase, cultural wounds require cultural medicine. Now, if one then undertakes to get beyond the difficulty, or really the impossibility of singling out individual youth, the question becomes how one might proceed to look at higher aggregations of Indigenous people. Now, the way we've done this, and there are other ways, is to look at the tribal or band level. Much of our work has been done here in British Columbia, where there are something like 203 distinct bands. Now, as it turns out, roughly half of these communities have never suffered a single youth suicide in the 20-plus years that such information has been collected. Now, by implication, the remaining half of these bands have high often heartbreakingly high levels of youth suicide. Now, the open question, the thing that inquiring minds want to know, is what is it that distinguishes those communities with low to absent youth suicide rates from those where suicide is epidemic? Now, one could look in many places for answers to such questions. Now, our own work has focused on the questions about individual and cultural continuity. And that phrase, which I said in quotes, the notion of continuity, concerns the fact that in order to be a coherent person, it's constitutive that one must have a sense of ownership of one's individual past. Elsewise, one might be an amnesic, for example, and to have a sense of commitment to one's own as yet unrealized future. Now, elevated to the level of whole cultural groups, it turns out that
Professor Chandler, I just wanted you to notice the 1 minute card, okay? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. What distinguishes communities or collections or aggregations of people from being simply a mob to a real coherent culture is similarly some sense of ownership of past and present at the level of whole communities. So much of the work that we've done, and hopefully Chris is prepared to describe some of that, is to try to find markers or defining features of whole indigenous communities that are associated with high and low suicide rates. So I'm sure I've raised more questions than I've answered, and hopefully in our question and answer period, I'll be able to speak to some of those. So enough from me, and on to.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Chandler. And Professor Lalonde, let's move right along into your remarks for 10 minutes, please. Stand by while we switch the streams here.
Really?
We may have lost Professor Lalonde. We'll just sit tight for a moment here and see if we can get him back. While we're doing so, Professor Chandler, if there's anything you'd like to add that you weren't able to fit in, we may as well make use of the moment. Oh, he's on mute now.
Our effort over what have been 3 decades have been to identify features of communities that have very low or absent youth suicide rates and set them apart from communities that have very high rates. And all of that turns on what we've chosen to call cultural continuity. And if Chris is back, I'll mute my speaker and let him go on. So is he there?
Okay. No, he's not with us yet, so I might suggest to committee members that we could go into the first round of questions if members are ready. I'm seeing some nods around the table, and then we'll manage Chris when he gets back. Anybody? Okay, so looks like I don't see anybody saying no to that idea. So yeah, let's proceed, if you don't mind, Professor, into some questions. And the first member of the committee that would like to ask a question is Mike Bossio.
Thank you, Professor Chandler, for joining us this afternoon. I'm quite excited about the type of work that you're doing, because I look at self-governance and cultural integrity as being really key here. in solving the suicide rates that are happening right now, the skyrocketing rates that are happening in our Indigenous communities. And maybe you could, there's a number of questions around it. I mean, maybe you could speak to where self-governance and self-determination have led to that cultural integrity and continuity, and where it was successful that you've seen so far, the size of community that where that was successful, and maybe others as to where it wasn't successful and why you feel that maybe it wasn't successful in those communities.
All right. Well, first, let me say that over the years, Chris Lalonde and I have identified 9 descriptors of Indigenous communities, roughly half of which concern their efforts to hold on to and to rehabilitate their cultural past. The other half concern issues that have to do with ownership of their own future. Now, as it turns out, matters of self-governance become a kind of keystone determinant that cuts across all of these measures. So communities that have achieved some measure of self-determination and self-governance have lower or absent rates relative to their counterpart communities which do not have such self-governance instruments. Other kinds of variables that we've looked at have to do with the efforts of communities to preserve their traditional language, to re-establish the role of women in governance, and to create facilities that are intended for the preservation of culture by allowing for ceremonial events and youth programs that focus on cultural rehabilitation. The other markers that we looked at that are more future-oriented concern things like some important voice in the policing of their communities, some efforts on the part of these communities to run their own child protection services, to shape their own educational practices in terms of including Indigenous matters in their curriculum.
Sorry, Professor,
fact,
can I, if you don't mind, can I ask?
Yes.
There is something I'd really like to get to here. Is there a kind of optimal size of community where self-governance is more successful versus those that are of a smaller nature or more isolated?
I'm not sure I have hard evidence to answer that question. And it's also, I think, and I'm sure you're aware of this, that initially the initiative of communities to try to win back some kind of governance control was, first it was a small number of groups, often I think some of the larger and groups with more resources. But later on, in effect, every community was invited to address the question of whether they either wished to have self-governance or wanted to be in a queue for which self-governance would eventually eventuate. I think the only hard evidence that I can speak to, and I understand, I think, the importance of your question, is that there are tribal groups which have essentially indentured themselves or trying to afford to achieve some measure of self-governance. And there is in place a scheme for rating how far given communities have proceeded. And it's a kind of 5-point scale, and 5 means you have self-governance of some sort, and 0 means you've not even gotten in the game. And it turns out that the suicide rate is highest among those communities that have tried to initiate self-governance but have bumped into some kind of glass ceiling, so that despite having kind of borrowed into their own future to pay for such legal help, they haven't yet
Professor,
achieved.
I hate to cut in again. I apologize, but my time is running out, and I want to get a little more information from you because I respect what you've got to say. And the last aspect I would say is, from a cultural rehabilitation standpoint, it's taken 10 generations to destroy many of our indigenous cultures. Do you have any indication as to how many generations it takes to rehabilitate it?
Just briefly, we're under a minute here. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know the answer to that question. My sense is that however it's rehabilitated, it won't look like it used to look. No matter how much you undertake to ensure a sense of cultural continuity, you can't persuade a teenage kid from an indigenous community to give up their Nikes in favor of moccasins, for example. Time is also passing, and so I don't know how many generations, which is your real question, are required to set things right. At this stage of the game, I don't even know that we know what right looks like.
Professor Lalonde, Chandler, Professor Lalonde has come back online. So we're at the end of Mike Bossio's allotted time for that question. So I'm going to suggest that we now hear from Professor Lalonde, and then we'll pick up the questioning where we left off, if that suits everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Chandler. And now, with fingers crossed, we'll switch to Professor Lalonde.
Thank you. I apologize. This room has been swarming with technicians for the last 15 minutes, but I hope I don't get cut off again. Thank you for having me. I, too, want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the territories of the Coast and Strait Salish peoples. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. I'm at a disadvantage here because I didn't get to hear what Michael said or the questions that were asked of him. And so I'll just say very briefly the one thing that I hope will come out of this work, and that is that Michael, I'm sure, outlined all of the problems inherent in trying to identify who might or who might not try to take their own lives, how difficult that is, and how many red herrings there are in that field. But a sort of precondition to understanding the size and scope of this problem is to get good and accurate data on suicide and suicide attempts and other bad things that befall youth in Indigenous and other communities. And at present, we don't do a very good job of making that data available for use, either by researchers, policymakers, or more importantly, communities themselves. And so one of the problems that Michael and I face is trying to get access to data at the level of communities. So you can talk about suicide rates for the province of British Columbia or the country of Canada, but that's not especially helpful if you're in a particular community, if you're a particular group of people. And so what we really need is good, accurate, ongoing data on things that are happening at the level of communities. And there are two reasons to say that. One is when we don't do that, then you read media accounts of an epidemic of suicide in the Indigenous population, which is just sort of a kind of fear-mongering that's insulting to people without giving anyone any means of acting. On the other hand, if as a particular First Nation you know that your suicide rate or your diabetes rate or your heart disease rate is either above or below the provincial average or the average of other communities in your area, then you have some information that you can act on. That is, when you know the size and scope of a particular problem, you can decide what you want to do about it. And at present, we don't provide that information back to communities, and I think there ought to be a way of providing a kind of report card to communities of where they stand on a list of important health outcomes so that they know what they can or should be trying to do to resolve that. And again, not having known what Michael might have said, I think I got cut off shortly after he said cultural wounds require cultural medicine, and I think that's a really important take-home message. The idea that if you want to do something about youth suicide rates, you don't necessarily need to target the issue of youth suicide. That is, to the extent that you promote healthy youth development, you prevent suicide. So it doesn't need to be earmarked for some sort of parachuted in suicide prevention program. To the extent that we can help communities promote their own cultural ways of doing things, we will, as a side benefit, I think, lower rates of suicide and other kinds of negative developmental outcomes. So I'll stop there and leave it for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. You do have about 7 minutes remaining in your allotment. If there was an area that you wanted to go deeper on, you're welcome to do that. Or, as you say, we could go to questions.
I think I'll just go to questions. I think that's more important than me probably repeating some things that Michael said.
Okay. Thanks very much. Then your first question will come from Kathy McLeod, please.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank both of the presenters. I'm also from British Columbia, so it's good to have your expertise here at the table. At first, I want to sort of dive down into the issue of data, and I guess my first question is it not available for use, or is it just not collected? So, for example, Health Canada would know every medical number that they pay for, which, of course, then you have sort of, things like suicide would be attached to the medical billing process. So that's my first question. Is that not available for privacy reasons, or what are the challenges there? Because I do believe data is an important issue.
Is there. It's kept. It's complicated for Indigenous people because the federal government keeps status Indian records and the provincial government makes actual payments. And so it's very difficult to actually access the data, even if people are willing to share it. It's been made a little bit more complicated in British Columbia because we have the tripartite agreement, and the First Nations Health Council now controls what's called the client file. And they are reluctant to share the data with researchers because they don't feel they have the authority to share data at the community level. So they can share data for the province, what's the suicide rate, but they don't feel that they have the authority to share community level data. And in British Columbia, where there are more than 200 communities, securing something like a band council resolution with 203 communities is just logistically impossible. And so the point that I've been trying to make is, if at the moment you feel that you're not authorized to share data with researchers of community level stuff, then share it back to the communities. Let the communities know where they stand. But I'm hopeful that as things move forward, we'll get data sharing agreements in place that will allow Michael and I and others to do the kind of work that we've been doing.
Sort of focus is Michael talked about the number of bands, and approximately half, you said, had not had a youth suicide in 20 years. Have you got any sense of change over time for the communities that have been impacted? Any sense that communities are moving forward on some of the areas that you've identified as being important in your research, and is it making a difference? So is that available in terms of data and information? And that's for Michael.
Okay.
I'm not sure which of us you're directing that question to. My sense is that the kind of work that Chris and I have been doing is of great interest to Indigenous communities, and is often used as a kind of point of argument to achieve some changes with their own provincial or federal governments. The fact that some changes are being made is I think, evidenced by the kind of uptake of this kind of research data. But my sense is that your strong question is it possible to identify communities that are in transition that have taken on some of these expectations about how to build a better way of rearing one's youth in a culturally sensitive way. And I think we just have to remain mute on that. I don't think we have the evidence to suggest that there has been, at least in the 15, 20 years that we've been collecting data, a whole lot of changes from then until now. Chris, you may have a different view on that.
A committee, we have put a lot of work into this very horrific tragedy that's happening. If you were going to say there is one sort of short, medium, and long-term recommendation that I would say should be part of your report, if you could put it into one of those, what would it be? And I could leave that.
Well, for me,
have time for both to answer.
I guess for me, it would be that cultures, communities that rehabilitate themselves against enormous odds, really, create environments that are healthy environments for raising kids. And so I think Chris's point was all these things need not be flagged as suicide prevention efforts, although sometimes that's how you get money to do these things. But that somehow regaining access to and owning one's cultural past and having a stake in one's own community's future, working on those two sort of backward and forward-looking aspects of change, to me, that's the ticket out of this predicament that we all struggle to try to understand.
I just want to go back to your earlier question about looking at change over time. And that's, I think, what Michael and I are very, very anxious to do. But again, it requires access to data that at the moment we don't have. About not targeting suicide prevention necessarily, I was at a meeting in Ottawa on Thursday on men's suicide and with a partial focus on Indigenous men's suicide. And one of the women that was at the table with me turned to me and said, "Wait a minute, are you Lalonde of Chandler and Lalonde?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Oh, I cite your work all the time." And I said, "Well, that's great." And we got to chatting, and I said, "What's more gratifying to us is not when someone cites our research in an academic work, but when someone in community uses it to justify getting something done." And she said, "Just a minute," and she texted me a photo of a cultural center that they built in her community, and they used our work to justify that if you build this center for cultural purposes, it will improve the health and well-being of young people. And she said 15 years ago we had a big problem with suicide and suicidality in our community, and we don't anymore. And that center employs 21 people now. So I think that's a sort of more long-term vision, that to the extent that you support communities to help themselves, they will.
Thank you. Yeah, we're out of time on that question, and I can't tell if you're sitting very still or if your feet is frozen. The next question is to Romeo, from Romeo Saganash, please. Is everybody frozen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both our witnesses for their contribution to this committee.
Romeo, before you carry on,
Yes.
I just want to make sure that we're still in contact here. There might be a...
I'm still here.
Okay. That was Michael, or...
That was Chris. Michael, are you still here?
Yeah, I'm muted, but I'm still here.
Okay,
But
well-
I didn't hear the question.
We just to let you know, we don't have your video feed anymore, but we can hear you just fine. So Romeo Saganash will proceed with the question.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question related to, I guess, the type of control that one community may have on its future or its destiny. I think that's an important component of all this discussion. I had the privilege to travel with the committee to Nunavut just past week, and there's a lot of discussion around those issues. My writing, which we visited on this trip, is composed of Cree, Inuit, and Algonquin communities. But the Cree and Inuit live under a land claims agreement called the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, whereby both groups have a certain measure of control over their local self-government, certain control over their certain institutions, particularly related to education and health. Nevertheless, given the fact that they both live under a certain legal regime or political regime similar in both cases, there's a marked difference in suicide rates between the Cree and the Inuit in that case. Would geography be also a determinant in all of this analysis? That's my first question to both of you.
Well, we
Perhaps Professor Lalonde.
go ahead, Michael.
Yeah. Oh.
Okay. We did look at some geographical analyses. So the first thought was perhaps being an especially remote community is either a good thing or a bad thing in terms of youth development. And when we looked at the data, we didn't see a clear relationship like that. The closest thing that we saw was that it seemed that communities that were near urban centers, but not large urban centers, were slightly at higher risk or had slightly higher rates of suicide than either remote communities or urban communities. So the kind of simple geographical analysis didn't really tell us very much. But Michael, you may want to add to that.
Well, only that certainly the Inuit are often pointed to as a group of individuals who in some way have self-government. They have successfully preserved, for the most part, their indigenous languages, and yet their suicide rate is high. So I think your intuition that somehow how far north one might need to go before one needs to change their sort of predictor variables in terms of who's going to commit suicide and who isn't. I think there's an untold story there. And there are people like the kind of McGill group who are looking at especially the Inuit communities. But I think that may be a separate story to be told there. And so people like Lisa Wexler, who I think are doing a really good job of trying to look at the differences that characterize Inuit communities and separate them from people somewhat further south.
Which brings me to my my second question. I know that in 2013 in British Columbia, there's this sectoral agreement that's in place since 2013 for healthcare services. This was called the First Nations Health Authority. Have we seen improvement since the First Nations took over those services and programs for their own communities? Because one of the things we've heard a lot over our 2.5-day visit up north was that communities wanted to define their own programs and services, determine their own programs and services. That's one big ask that we've heard over and over again during our visit. Was there any improvement since that 2013 sectoral agreement in British Columbia?
Well, I think that question would be better asked of First Nations Health Authority because they have the data. So I don't think we have any way of answering that question except to say that what really has changed is the level of engagement of communities in health planning and processes. I think they've done a really good job of engaging the communities, and I think that, as you say, the communities want a say in designing and implementing their own programs, and I think First Nations Health Authority at least provides the kind of structure that would allow that to happen.
Was that the end of your remark, Professor Lalonde?
Yes, it was.
All right, thank you very much. We'll go on to the next question. It's also a 7-minute question like the ones previous, and it's from Michael McLeod, please.
Thank you, and thank you both for the presentations. Very interesting observations and studies that you've done. And we just spent the better part of last week going to Nunavik and Nunavut and heard many people speak on this issue, and a lot of what you're raising is also reflected in their words. We heard very clear from especially people in Nunavik that there's a need for crisis centers in the community, cultural centers, family centers, and you've raised the issue that having a cultural center and part of your study showed that it lowered the levels of suicide. I've been talking about facilities such as friendship centers quite a bit over the last while because I'm a strong believer that every community needs an organization such as this that deals with sport, recreation, culture, and education, all these programs, including services crisis centers at times. And if you look at the North, and I'm from the Northwest Territories, we've had in all the territories, including Yukon, Nunavut, Nunavik, and Labrador, we've had well over 1,000 people commit suicide in the last 15 years. And however, if you look at the different parts of the North, including Northwest Territories on the southern part where we have friendship centers, that level is low, including the community I live in. We've had a friendship center for over 25 years when we've never had a youth suicide. And if you start looking at the people that are committing suicide, in my writing, and we have different nations of people in the Northwest Territories, it's the Inuit male that are committing suicide that live in the further northern communities, and there is very little in terms of facilities, certainly no friendship centers. And Nunavut has no friendship centers except for one in Rankin Inlet, and I don't believe Nunavik has any either. So we don't have that type of facilities, but I'm wondering if you had looked at the role that facilities such as friendship centers play, existing programs that are out there that help alleviate this problem.
Just before anyone answers, there was some noise on the audio line, and it's possible that it's coming from someone handling the microphone or the wire attached to the microphone. So just something to be aware of as we proceed. Thanks. And Michael, was there anybody in particular you were directing that question to?
I think Mr. Lalonde had talked about a facility that proved that cultural centers work and help alleviate this problem. So I just wanted to ask him if he had looked at friendship centers.
I guess that's for you, Professor Lalonde.
Okay. We didn't look specifically at friendship centers. At least in British Columbia, friendship centers tend to be located in cities rather than within communities. But I have no doubt that having a friendship center in a community is what we'd call a protective factor. So, Michael, I don't know if you talked about our work in Manitoba at all. So I hope I'm not repeating myself here, but we consulted with communities in each of the 5 cultural territories in Manitoba to look at how we could move our research program from British Columbia, where it started, to Manitoba, which is a very different historical and political landscape. And so we consulted with communities about what things they thought would promote culture within their communities. And one of the common themes that came out of that was the need to facilitate interaction between elders and youth. So in every community, that was an important need that they identified. And they had very different ideas about how to do that within each of their communities, given that you have an exploding population of youth and a rapidly shrinking population of elders. It becomes a very difficult thing to do. But it seemed like the first thing that you needed was a venue, a place where elders and youth could interact. And so how the shape of that kind of venue changed from community to community. For some, it was something like a friendship center, as you described. For others, it was finding ways to get youth and elders together on the land to participate in traditional activities. So that doesn't necessarily require a building, but it certainly requires resources to get people out onto the land and do the activities that they want to do. But I think that having a facility that's designated for these kinds of cultural purposes is critical, because that's just the building. What goes on inside the building is designed and implemented by the people in the community, and I think that's where the sort of most powerful effects come from.
I wanted to ask and maybe this issue was covered in some of the larger themes that were raised, but the issue of housing came up at every one of our discussions in the communities, and the lack of housing was raised by almost every presenter, and how that plays into the sense of despair that's in our communities, in our Aboriginal populations, and that's kind of reflected in the youth. And during one of the presentations, it was noted that if the housing situation was dealt with, if housing supply was adequate, we would probably lower the social problems in our communities by 50%. Now, have you guys looked at the issue of overcrowding, housing shortages in the different communities as a factor?
We did look at a measure of crowding, and we found a slight increase in suicide rates as the number of persons per room in the house went up. But I think that's potentially misleading, because in some ways it's not the number of people in the house that matters, it's the quality of the housing and whether or not the people want to be there. So when you have extended families living together in adequate housing, that's a good thing, even if there are 2.4 persons per bedroom in the house or something. Whereas if you have one person per room in a very substandard housing, or a whole bunch of people in a house that are living together out of necessity and not out of familial love, I think that's a bad thing.
Thanks.
So I think you need to separate the issue. I just think you need to separate the issue of crowding from quality.
Okay. Thanks for that clarification. We're out of time on that question, but we're going to move into 5-minute questions now. And the first 5-minute question is from David Yurtica.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank Professor Chandler and Professor Lalonde for joining us here today. It's a very important study, and I think everyone around this table wants to resolve this in some way. One of the things, like was mentioned earlier, some of our community members traveled to Nunavut and northern Quebec, and some of the things we heard was there's a lack of opportunity, and there's isolation, poverty, and housing. And it is a major factor in the current mental health issues in that region. So, to what extent did your research measure community economic conditions in relation to mental health? And I address to anyone who wants to answer it.
Well, we looked at a number of economic issues, at least here in British Columbia. So we looked at average income in the community, percentage of income that comes from government transfers, levels of education, labor participation, and there was not any clear relationship between those variables and rates of suicide. Now, you could argue that maybe it's because there isn't enough variability in economic indicators across the communities to be able to show anything. But what it seemed to suggest is that at least the communities that were slightly more well off than others weren't necessarily the ones with the low suicide. So it wasn't necessarily economic activity, although I absolutely understand where you're coming from in terms of sensed opportunities for youth within communities. And I think that's the thing that needs to be addressed more than the number of persons participating in the labor force. Although that's important, I don't think it's the sort of magic bullet for this particular issue.
Yeah, just like I was mentioning earlier, there's a sense that there's no direction right now for the Indigenous youth. And so we're trying to understand there's more than one issue. There's one, it's, whether it's a lack of housing, whether it's a lack of opportunity. But which area should we address first? I mean, it's obvious it's very difficult to address everything at once. Which area would you like to address first if we could? What is the highest priority?
Well, I think the take-home message from our work is that when communities get control over their own lives, better things happen than when they don't. And so I think communities should be answering that question rather than us. I mean, for some, the really imperatively important thing was to get their culture into the curriculum in their schools. That if our young people grow up knowing who they are, being taught in their schools and supported in their communities, that will sustain them across whatever other adversities that they might face. For other communities, it was clearly more resource-based, that why is the diamond company getting all of the riches of the resources of our land and we're not? And so I think without having to point to one thing, I would say it's up to communities to decide which thing it is, and it's our job as the rest of Canada to support them in gaining and regaining control over their kind of civic, political, and cultural lives.
How many minutes got left?
Still got half your time.
Okay, excellent. During our visit to the north, it was mentioned that the community is always in a mode of crisis. And how is this going to affect them in the long term? I mean, when the community is always, it's becoming normalized for individuals to commit suicide, and the shock factor isn't there anymore. So what can be done to address that, short term, long term?
Well, I think the short-term answer regarding crises is to provide immediate sort of on-the-ground support. And what form that takes depends on what the crisis is and what the community needs. But the longer-term problem is we imagine that if we just bring in some support workers for a week to talk to the youth and then they go away, we haven't really done anything at all. We've sort of calmed the waters momentarily, but the underlying underlying issues are still going to be there. So for the longer term, I think it's the need to find ways to support the communities over the long term. So for example, when I was talking about elder and youth interaction, the community can decide what form that takes, but the resources to do that can't be another one-off program that, you know, people come in, they kick up the dust, and then they're gone. There needs to be sort of more long-term funding support for the things that communities want to do to be able to help their youth. And I think the problem with particular programs is they tend to be focused on particular things, like, say, suicide prevention, for a particular period of time, 3 months or maybe a year. I mean, even the sort of research programs that Michael and I try to put together, which are aimed not just at extracting data from the communities, but helping them find ways to support themselves and their youth, at most those things are 2 or 3 years long. And then once again, we're gone. And I think there needs to be a way to get around that somehow. I don't know what it is, but I think there needs to be a way to provide those long-term resources.
Okay, thank you for the response, and we're going to move on to a 5-minute question from Don Resnack, please.
Well, thank you for appearing before the committee today. It's a pleasure to hear from you and your perspective from the West Coast. I also want to acknowledge we have our member from Nunavut here today, a friend of mine, Hunter Tutu, and I'd like to acknowledge his presence here today. So I've been thinking since we started this study, and you just echoed kind of my frustration in terms of previous governments' responses to suicide crises and epidemics across this country in Indigenous and Northern communities. Doing one-off programs where people make a big stink about a crisis that's happening. In the moment, the government reacts, sends in healthcare workers for a finite amount of time, and then there's good results or mixed results, and then everything washes up. And it's ignored, and then it cycles back into the norm. Another thing I kind of wanted to touch on is what I see as the solution, or one of the solutions perhaps to the problem, and the ultimate solution perhaps. You mentioned a side benefit of the positive things that self-government brings, but self-government that is truly realized. I believe you mentioned a glass ceiling, self-determination hitting a glass ceiling. And one, I'd like you to explain what you meant by that, and perhaps comment on any of the other numerous comments I made.
Okay, well, maybe I should at least start an answer to this question. I think that governments better understand how to deal with individual problems than they understand how to deal with cultural problems. So, you know, it's common in British Columbia and across Canada for communities to declare themselves in some kind of suicide crisis circumstance. And as a result, we parachute in a bunch of people who are trained counselors. But it's a puzzle. I mean, if you were parachuted in and having spent all the time you have looking at this problem, what could you or would you do? And so I think we have this sort of individual focus. We're going to come in and solve a problem of a series of individuals who are inclined to commit suicide, while ignoring the real cultural devastation that underlies this sense of loss and impotence and lack of control of one's own destiny. So here's a thought about how you might more coherently intervene. if it's the case that you can identify, certainly as we can identify here in BC, groups of bands of communities that have never had a youth suicide, I think we have to presume that they know something about how to raise children who believe that life is worth living. And so there is Indigenous knowledge sedimented in those communities that have few or no suicides, and that intervention programs that tried to pair up communities with high and low suicide rates would be a novel solution, and a solution different than just bringing in some kind of platoon of counselors who themselves don't know what results in suicide.
So, how much time do I have? Well, I was just going to make another comment, and just we kind of all know what got us here in terms of Indigenous suicide: the colonialization, residential schools, the Indian Act, and everything we've done to the Indigenous communities across this country. The one quick question, if the chair allows me to ask it, is there one answer for all communities, or have you seen something that's worked? One answer that's worked right across the country? I don't think there is.
The biggest question with the least amount of time.
There isn't. Yeah. No, there isn't one single solution. But I think if you look at the kinds of solutions that we've found or the communities have found worked, things like supporting elder-youth interaction, the form of that, how that takes in any community can be wildly different, but it's the factor itself of promoting that. The notion of giving communities control over education, that can take different forms in different places, but for most communities that means inserting their culture into the curriculum that their children are being asked to learn. If you look at language, there are different ways to support language revitalization, and communities will figure out what works best in their communities. So the answer is no, there isn't one. There are probably several dozen, and the communities are better placed than us to tell you the form of those things.
Thank you both for that response. We're out of time, however, because of the technical difficulties, we're going to just proceed for one final 5-minute question, even though it goes beyond our 4:30 limit, and that's going to come from Arnold Viersen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our guests for being here today. I'm assuming that you must have had something to do with the ITK's proposal on suicide, because we're hearing a lot of the same terms: cultural continuity, protective factors, risk factors, these kinds of things. One of the things that, for me, I do need some clarification on is there some ability to define what cultural continuity means? There's fairly tangible aspects to it, and there's fairly non-tangible aspects to it. And then if you could go into how passing that on to the next generation, or raising kids. Michael, I think you talked about that. You've mentioned that term now, raising kids. You've said that 3 times. How that plays into it, and how people work with that. So can you define cultural continuity, first of all?
Well, I think in some sense, it's easy enough to define in the abstract. That is, the assumption is that a principal consequence of colonization has been to demean the cultural past of Indigenous people, and in some paternalistic way take out of their hands control of their own future. So if broadly defined continuity of culture is a way of preserving a connection to one's past and a sense of ownership of one's future, then, and here I echo something that Chris has said various times, that the particular way that that might be done will probably vary importantly from community to community. But the broad outlines of the task is to act in a kind of restorative way, which essentially allows Indigenous people to value and rehabilitate their endangered culture or absent culture, and to restore their rights to control their own future and that of their children. So at the kind of broad level, it's easy enough to define what it means to talk about the continuity of a culture and time. What it means in the particular for a given community really varies from one community to the next and needs to be hammered out by the members of that community itself. So I answered part, or I addressed part of your question, but there was a tail end to it, which I need to be reminded of.
How does that relate to raising children? You mentioned raising kids now. You mentioned that 3 times. Cultural continuity, passing our culture on to the next generation. What would be some of the factors that come into passing that on to the next generation? Who's in control of that, and where does that go?
Well, I can speak to that briefly, Michael. One of the factors that we found, I don't know if Michael summarized this, was the participation of women in local governance, that when women formed a majority, a simple majority of the band councils, suicide rates were lower in those communities than where women were absent or a minority. And so Michael and I tried to figure out what it was that could signal. Does it signal something about the women when they form a majority, or does it signal something about the community that would elect a majority of women? And so I had a graduate student who said, well, why don't we just go ask those women? And that seemed like a really good idea. So she drove all around British Columbia interviewing band counselors and chiefs and former chiefs. And we were very careful not to say anything about suicide, not to say anything about youth health, just to ask them how it was they came to be involved in the governance of their people. And when we looked at the transcripts, almost everything that these women said had to do with preparing the next generation. Okay, so they saw it really as a kind of nurturing role, and they were very explicit about how that meant both to create a firm cultural foundation for the youth within their community and to equip them to be able to walk in 2 worlds, in the Indigenous world and the non-Indigenous world. And so I think the notion of raising children pervades Indigenous communities in ways that are plain to anyone who goes into those communities. The fact that we've had several generations of parents removed from the raising of children makes that more poignant, but I think that First Nations people understand better than anyone else that raising the next generation of children is our most important job in this world.
Well, Professor Lalonde, Professor Chandler, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and thoughtful remarks on behalf of the committee. We're at the end of our time now, but I would like to let you know that Michelle Legault, the clerk of our committee, will be sending you an email address. It's a web link to a portal where I would invite you to submit a brief or any other comments that you would like to, up to 3,000 words, that will be rolled into the Indigenous suicide study, along with the remarks that we've heard from you today and the remarks that we've heard, in fact, from all of our witnesses. So another opportunity to get some more input if we were unable to cover everything today. But again, I want to say thank you, and I hope that we have a chance to speak with you again.
Thank you for taking the time to hear from us, and I apologize to the translators for how fast I talk. Thanks.
They're professionals. They did just fine.
They have to deal with us.
Okay, thanks so much. And we're going to suspend for a couple of minutes while we disconnect and prepare for our in-camera session. You can't understand me, though.